Hey guys, it's the Comics Kid 2099, and today I am bringing you an episode of I Stand Alone. If you haven't seen one of these before, basically I read a single issue, and then I determine, does the single issue stand by itself? Do you need backstory? Do you need future issues to really understand what's going on? We live in a world today where a comic book story by Brian Michael Bendis might take 6 or 7 issues, and if you jump in the middle, you might not have any idea what's going on. Now, sometimes you can have a very gifted writer who can write a multi-part storyline, and they can still make it feel like you understand everything because you're getting all the relevant information that you're getting in that issue. So, having said all that, which comic book am I going to be talking about today? I'm going to be talking about an Image comic called 1963, Book 1. This series was actually, there were 6 issues, and each one had a different title on it. So this one is Mystery Incorporated, and basically it was written by Alan Moore. If you've read any amount of comics, you may know who Alan Moore is. He wrote The Watchmen, V for Vendetta, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He did Swamp Thing for a little while. These comics are very anti-Alan Moore, if that makes any sense. Usually, and I don't want to generalize too much, but usually most of the things that Alan Moore has written are very dark. They're very, they were revolutionary in the 1980s, if that makes any sense. And of course there is some exception to the rule. For one, the 1963 stuff that he did at Image. Later he did some stuff for Supreme, and then even later still he did some stuff with Tom Strong, which was, I haven't read, but from what I understand it was very colorful, very retro, and it was nothing like anything else he had ever done. This stuff is somewhere in the middle. It's not Watchmen V for Vendetta dark. It's also not as pure and kind of childishly simplistic and light as Supreme or what I've heard the Tom Strong stuff is. If you just read it, it definitely feels like, okay, this is kind of a lighthearted jab at the Marvel stuff from the 1960s. So this team right here is very similar to the Fantastic Four. There's another character called the Fury, and he's very similar to Spider-Man. Then there's another guy, I don't remember his name, he's kind of like Captain America. You've basically got the Marvel Silver Age stuff happening in these 6 issues. And there's a lot of, like, this right here is kind of a jab at an advertisement you might see in a comic book from the 60s. Like, oh, do you want to get jacked and ripped in 10 days? Okay, take this and send it in with 10 cents or whatever, and you'll get the Charles Atlas method or whatever. You know, it's stuff like that. It's clearly a hoax. What makes it kind of middle ground, what makes it not as lighthearted or it makes it a little bit darker, is that this is also a jab, and not even a lighthearted jab, just a straight-up jab at the 1990s anti-hero type. If you've read a book like Kingdom Come, Kingdom Come is definitely a book that says, this is what the heroic figure used to be. This is what it has become. This is very clearly a de-evolution. It is a downward slide. This is not good. Alex Ross and Mark Waid were very clearly saying characters like Cable, Youngblood, those characters are not heroes. They are not what a superhero is meant to be, and it is meant to be a hero underscored. This is kind of along those same lines. It's taking the heroes of yesteryear and it is pitting them against the heroes of today. Of course, this came out in 1993. Unfortunately, that theme is kind of buried for a couple of reasons. One, the story as is incomplete. Now, as I said, this was a 6-issue miniseries, with each issue featuring a different character from this universe. There was planned to be more. I've heard there was at least an 80-page giant that was planned. Basically, see, I'm kind of jumping all over the place. I should go ahead and talk about the plot of this issue before I get into what I was just talking about. You've got this group, they're called Mystery Incorporated. They're very similar to the Fantastic Four. And the issue starts off with this guy, the Planet. He is going through this Mystery Mile, I think is what their headquarters is. And it's basically just a really long runway that is their headquarters, and it's underground. And they are testing him. They're trying to see, okay, is our headquarters secure? How far can he get? Can he get past all our defenses? And he gets through most of them, but they still stop him before he gets to the heart of Mystery Mile. And then, this woman right here, I don't even remember her name. They all have a code name, but honestly, it doesn't really matter. As long as, as long as you're very familiar with the Fantastic Four, you know this is meant to be Johnny Storm, this is meant to be Reed Richards, Ben Grimm, and Susan Storm. So it doesn't really matter what these characters' names are, because the only difference is, instead of Sue and Johnny being brothers and sister, Johnny and Ben are brothers, and then Johnny and Reed here are kind of fighting for the affections of Sue. It's a little weird. Basically, she kind of goes off on her own. She's a little bit whiny because they get lots of fan mail, just as the Fantastic Four used to back in the 1960s. And then she sees a guy intruding in Mystery Mile, and she's like, well, I'll stop him. And let me see if I can quickly find a picture of this guy. All we know is that he's got a bow and arrow. We know nothing else about this guy. So she contacts the rest of her team. They go to find him. Johnny Storm here finds the intruder with a bow and arrow, and then he has this little electronic capturing arrow. See, he's got a lot of trick arrows, kind of like Hawkeye or Green Arrow, I guess. And he captures the electronic signals of Johnny Storm here, and it captures him inside this little device. Well, then the other three, they realize that this intruder with a bow and arrow, he has escaped and he has captured little brother here, so they are going to go after him. Into the Maybe Machine. The Maybe Machine, I guess, is, the Image Comics version of the Phantom Zone or the Negative Zone. It's a window into alternate universes. And the Reed Richards of this comic, this guy right here, he theorizes that this intruder is from an alternate universe, but not only an alternate universe, also from the future of an alternate universe. And he draws a little chalk line from 1993 diagonally down to 1963. Now, this is a big spoiler for the final issue of the 1963 storyline. So if you have not read any of these, I'm about to do a little bit of spoiling here. So as long as my thumb is up, I'm talking spoilers. So you can just mute the video if you don't want to hear any spoilers. And then once you see my thumb go down, then you know that I'm done talking spoilers. Once again, if you have not read any of the 1963 issues, I am about to spoil the very end of the 6th issue, The Tomorrow Syndicate. So, having said that, prepare for some spoilers. The guy with the bow and arrow is actually Shaft from Youngblood. Now, honestly, I can't really understand what was being planned, but at the very end of issue 6 of this 1963 storyline, you see the guy with the mask and the jumpsuit, and he's got the arrow with the guy from Johnny Storm guy from Mystery Incorporated, and then he takes off his mask, and it's Shaft. And all he says is, well, now things are about to get a little more interesting. Now, we don't know why Shaft was invading this alternate universe. We don't know why he kidnapped the Johnny Storm character. But in the first issue, the Mystery Incorporated issue, he tells Johnny Storm to prepare for the final War of the Worlds. Now, at first you might be thinking, oh, okay, aliens. But then once you read the end of the Tomorrow Syndicate story, then you're like, oh, okay, a war of alternate worlds. So, apparently, Alan Moore was planning some big, sprawling crossover that was going to have characters like Shadowhawk, Youngblood, the Savage Dragon, and Spawn all of these guys from the 1990s were going to somehow be fighting these characters from the 1960s. The Tomorrow Syndicate, Mystery Incorporated, The Fury, Inman. These guys were, in a lot of ways, doing the same story that eventually was done with Kingdom Come. Although, admittedly, people are going to be talking about Kingdom Come for years and years and years, whereas Mystery Incorporated is mostly going to be relegated into obscurity, unfortunately. And so, that is all of the spoilers, the most major spoilers. Basically, this story is very fun. However, if you don't know anything about the Silver Age of Marvel Comics, if you don't know anything about when Image Comics was formed, you might read this and you might actually think that this was a comic from the 60s. I know when I first read this, I was a little confused because I was thinking, it feels like it's a retro comic. It feels kind of like it's an old school story. And then at one point they reference Mystery Incorporated issue 23. They reference somebody called Amazona who attacked Mystery Mile. And then they say, go check out Mystery Incorporated issue 23. There is no Mystery Incorporated issue 23, sadly. And this is something that all 6 of these issues did. They reference comic books that do not exist to kind of give it that same retro flavor. In the 1960s, if Spider-Man said something like, oh, hey, I haven't seen the X-Men since that one time whenever I was fighting Morbius, the living vampire. And then at the bottom of the panel, it might say, go check out Marvel Team-Up issue whatever. That was a thing that was done in the 60s, on up until the 90s even. So yeah, it's trying to recreate that flavor. Unfortunately, if you are a brand new comic book reader and you might be scouring the dollar bin at your local comic book store, if you see this, if you're interested and you pick it up, you're not going to know. You're not going to know that there's no such thing as Mystery Incorporated 23 until you Google it, until you find out, oh, okay, this whole thing is kind of meant to be a farce. There is no 1963 universe, and these characters do not appear outside of the 6 issues that Alan Moore and Rick Veitch and all those guys did. That's kind of disappointing because this story is a lot of fun. It is a lot of fun to see Alan Moore writing comics that, in theory, could have existed in the 60s. Now, there's some of the others in this 6-issue mini that feel a little bit more edgy. There's one where the Captain America type guy, he stops the assassination of John F. Kennedy. You're pretty much guaranteed to not find a comic book like that in the 1960s. Nobody would have done a story where a superhero tries to save a president because nobody would have done a story where the president was in any danger. That would have been very risky for the comic book business if they had tried to do something like that. So, yeah, some of these comics were a little bit more out of place and would not have felt as much like they were from the 1960s. Now, you might be wondering, well, what happened to this story? There was the 6-issue mini, 1963, and then after that, it just all kind of fell apart. If you're not familiar with Alan Moore, basically, he has a grudge against everybody in the comic book industry. He will never ever work again with DC Comics. He will never ever work again with Marvel Comics, and something happened. I don't know what it is, but something happened where he was not going to finish this story. So the 80-page giant that was going to cross over Spawn, Shadowhawk, Savage Dragon, and Young Blood with all of these 1963 characters, for some reason, never happened. I can only assume that Alan Moore got on the wrong side of somebody at Image Comics. He probably thought that he was more important than what he actually was, and so somebody said something, and he got mad and decided he wasn't going to do it. Having said that, this story did not end the relationship between Alan Moore and Image Comics. As I said, he went on to recreate the character Supreme, and he wrote that character for a little over a year. There are 2 trade paperbacks, Supreme, the Story of the Year, and The Return. I don't remember which order you're supposed to read those, but between those 2 trades by Checker Imprint, I think, they did the printing of those trades, that collects all of Alan Moore's Supreme run. And if you have read the 1963 comics, I would suggest go and read his Supreme run, because it's a lot of the same thing, where with 1963 he was kind of making fun of Marvel in the 60s a little bit. With the Supreme stuff, he was kind of sort of poking fun at the Superman stuff from the 1960s. If you're interested in that retro-flavored comics, then I would suggest go and check that stuff out. Also, several years ago, Stephen Bissette, who is somebody who had worked on these 1963 stories, I'm not sure in what way he worked on them, if he was one of the artists. I think he was the artist for one of the 6 issues. Apparently, he was very interested in creating some new stories with the character that he had co-created. I think he co-created the character In-Man, who is kind of supposed to be the Hulk, but was pretty different. It wasn't quite as cut and dry as this Mystery Incorporated thing. Stephen Bissette wanted to do a new story featuring In-Man. However, Alan Moore, for some reason, was just furious at this idea, and he basically blocked Bissette and said, no, you're not going to do that. So, for whatever reason, we have no idea why, Alan Moore is not going to let these comics be reprinted in trade, and he is not going to let the artists who co-created these characters with him do future stories without his involvement. I don't know why. It's very sad, because this story, in my opinion, could have been really good. Alan Moore was onto something very clearly. The idea of pitting yesteryear's heroes against the anti-heroes of the 90s, like I said, that came into its own in a very big way just a couple of years later with Kingdom Come. And then you had other authors like Grant Morrison, who was also working with that vibe with his JLA run, and then working on The Flash with Mark Miller. This was a very popular idea, kind of returning to the heroic archetype of the past. However, for whatever reason, this story never came to be, and so basically what we have is 6 issues of, admittedly, it's a really fun story, but it's not quite the story that it was aiming to be. It's just a story that kind of looks like it's making fun of the 1960s. Unfortunately, it's not quite as good as it had the potential to be because of that. And that brings us to the question, does this comic stand alone? I would have to say, no, it doesn't. You really, really need a vast working knowledge of Marvel Comics from the 1960s. You need to have an understanding of, okay, this was kind of how Stan Lee presented himself in the letters column. This was kind of how the entire Marvel Comics office presented itself. Even up until the 80s, you would see this fictionalized version of what the Marvel Comics team was like. You really kind of have to understand, okay, this is kind of what the Hulk was like back then, and then this is what Alan Moore is kind of doing with that archetype. Also, if you have no idea what Image Comics is, if you don't know that they were founded in the 1990s, then you might actually be naive enough to think that this is a team that existed in the 60s. I know I was, and I was very disappointed to find out, okay, no, it's not. This is just a new team that is pretending to have existed in the 1960s. So yeah, unfortunately, this does not stand alone. However, if you can find all 6 of these issues, they will have the 1963 logo on the Image Comics logo there. I would suggest picking these up. You can probably find them dirt cheap. I think I got each of mine for about 30 cents to $1 each. Very cheap. Please do yourself a favor and pick these up. They are very entertaining, and I think they will especially hold a special place in your heart if you have a fondness for Marvel Comics in the 1960s. That is about all I have to say today. I will talk to you guys very soon with some other kind of video. Until then, I will catch you guys later. See you then.